Good afternoon, and welcome once again to African American Literature. So, we began with some preliminary questions about Booker T. Washington, and I just want to continue on with some of the basic questions about him, important observations that we should pay attention to. He definitely was very highly invested in a self reliance philosophy. He was born in Franklin County, Virginia in 1856. Researchers have later discovered his father was actually white, his mother black, a slave named Jane. So Washington um, was one of those figures who actually had the experience of plantation slavery in his background. And his story is often associated with the classic Americanist Bildungsroman, that whole idea of the coming of age story. And then on the other hand, it's also a story that's associated with the idea of the self made person, the self made man, the self made woman, the concept of lifting oneself up from with one's own bootstraps. And of course, that line from the Cotton Exposition speech, cast down your buckets where you are, is a quintessential illustration of that ethos within the discourse of Booker T. Washington. So he began his education illustrating the quintessential quest for literacy within the African American tradition by attending night school as he worked in the coal mines, initially the salt furnaces in West Virginia. And so this was the foundation that helped him to commit to a lifetime of learning. It's significant that all of his early work is invoked in his autobiography as having been crucial to his development, intellectually speaking. He attended Hampton Institute in the Chesapeake area of Virginia. Interestingly, I actually initially decided to go to Hampton to attend college there, and my mom and I made a visit up there. But at the last minute, I ended up deciding that I would attend Spelman. And I'm very much a product of Tuskegee myself. My parents met at Tuskegee. And so the heritage of Booker T. Washington is something that I inevitably think of when I think of aspects of my background. And it's fair to say that Hampton and Tuskegee are the two primary institutional contexts that have been associated with him in his life. So he was also very rare in having been an African American serving as the president of a college in the late 19th century. It was much more typical for whites to serve as presidents of colleges during that time. So Booker T. Washington, his legacy is definitely characterized by heavy investments in white philanthropy, not only through his own educational story, but ultimately through the support that sustained Tuskegee over time. He was a major broker on the national stage in that respect. And it'll be useful to reflect more on those aspects of his legacy. So he wrote several autobiographies and definitely is associated with that tradition of serial autobiography that we have begun to track in our examination of African American literature. It was evident early on in the repertoire of Alada Equiano. It was there for Frederick Douglass. It is there in an example like Booker T. Washington. And significantly, he examines slavery as a school for blacks, and that I think is a very significant aspect of the and controversial too for some of his critics. But slavery emerges as a school that taught the black population valuable lessons, and for some of his critics, this was a narrative perceived as being somewhat accommodationist, one that pandered to the racialist views of the time. And so that's something definitely to keep in mind. Notably, Washington talks about how well informed the slaves were during the Civil War era, that they always knew what was going on, that they were even in some ways privy to information that the master class had yet to hear. And so that's an interesting and curious paradox. And he talks about the role that certain slaves played in getting the mail and how they used that role to their advantage. And so again, this speaks to the just the resourcefulness of the slave population. He really also reflects at that juncture in an interesting way on the question of literacy, noticing that in spite of the illiteracy, the widespread illiteracy associated with this population, somehow they always managed to be in the know about what was happening. And we're way ahead of the, in terms of understanding the implications of the Civil War for the black slave population. So even if the implications were not as clear, or even if they were perceived very differently within the master class, people in the slave population had high hopes that the Civil War would result in their emancipation. Note that Washington describes freedom as something about which his mother had long dreamed. And so those dimensions embedded into his narrative are particularly perceptive when it comes to his reading of the slave population. He talks about his mother's purchase. We go back to some of that language that we saw in Frederick Douglass's narrative. The language that says that when his mother was purchased on her plantation, it didn't arouse any more interest than that of an animal would have. And so that's really significant. Note how he describes his family meals in saying that, I don't remember ever a time sitting around a table and with my family and having the meal blessed in the way that, he came to eventually know. Instead, he describes this kind of hand to mouth existence that he and his family experienced within slavery. And I think that's key. The moment with the ginger cakes is particularly noteworthy. And he talks about what it was like to witness the young white uh, women eat the ginger cakes, and how once he saw that moment, it became an aspiration for him too to actually someday consume ginger cakes. And so he associates the privilege of eating ginger cakes with the experience of freedom. And so this is something that he begins to aspire to early on. It's significant that the scholar Maurice O. Wallace has read this scene very provocatively in suggesting that the ginger cakes are a symbolic reference to a kind of sexual desire that that Washington experienced related to this like young women population, and that it really suggested. I mean that it was a kind of awakening in terms of his manhood, and so that also makes the moment particularly interesting to think about and analyze. There is the epistemology on sexuality, Tacit 2, where Washington talks about the big house and what a privilege and honor it was for selected black slaves to be in charge of protecting the big house and the mistress during the Civil War. Douglass, in his repertoire, also spoke about the um, faithfulness of black male servants to the master class during the era of the Civil War, underscoring that I think that what we need to recognize is that this is a kind of backdoor way of talking about the and acknowledging the myth of a black rapist. So he spends time underscoring the trustworthiness of the black population in that particular scene. Underscores the trustworthiness so that they can underscores the trustworthiness so that he can maybe confront more strategically the myths of blackness as being this kind of pred the black people and black men specifically as being predatory and also inimical to the white population. In fact, he takes many pains to underscore how committed blacks remain to their masters and the integrity that they brought to the master-slave relationship, even after emancipation, even when they didn't have to. He tells that story about the ex-slave who walked many miles, several hundred miles, in order to pay his master $300 that he had promised as a for the privilege of working away, and he was in Ohio. So even in the post-emancipation moment, he went back. And so in all of this, Washington is very much underscoring the integrity of the black slave population and their fair-mindedness regarding the white master class. And in some cases, note the way that he associates. I mean, he speaks to the intimacies between these populations. Talks about ways in which ex-slaves continue to, in some cases, support their former masters and mistresses after slavery was over, or the son of the a former master, or how much they grieved the losses of people who had owned them within the Civil War. And so this is a much more nuanced portrait of the black slave experience than we get typically. That because the formulas for analyzing it have so frequently been binary that they've missed those nuances. And so these are aspects of the black slave experience that Washington is keen to acknowledge. So that's something that I think we can pay attention to and look at very productively. More provocatively, Washington suggests that the black man got as much out of slavery as whites did. These may be points that are much more unsettling, but this is really part of the narrative that that Washington presents, that's so invested in sanctioning notions of self help, and that self help narrative runs through Washington's book very saliently. It's significant that in discussing, I want to draw your attention too to the references to singing. That he notes how the singing among the black slaves intensified right before the moment of emancipation. It takes us back to Frederick Douglass and his comment on the singing among the black population on the plantations like Colonel Lloyd's or Captain Anthony's that he was familiar with. But the singing of the slaves bears noting in Washington as well. He talks about the idea, like, as they would sing and, speak of freedom and never link that freedom to freedom on earth. They would say that, oh, I'm referring to the afterlife. But in the immediate time before the Emancipation Proclamation, they got a lot bolder. And as he put it, they threw off the mask. And so we go right back to the mask invoked by Paul Laurence Dunbar in that reference of Washington's. And so I think that is a significant moment that he gives us. There's also the reference to assuming a new name. That's really significant, assuming a new name. And so he talks about how slaves were named singularly or referred to as their master's property in their naming. And so this is something that comes up, early on for him. And then, when we get to his personal naming later on, he acknowledges that he was first referred to as Booker, and that was the only name he knew. But when he went to school, he saw that the kids had two names at least, and so he came up with the name Washington for himself, and later added the name Taliaferro once he learned that his mother had given him that name and it slipped out of memory. And so all of these factors throw the phenomenon of naming into bold relief in Washington's Up From Slavery and underscore its significance for the Black population in ways that recollect the, the salience of naming within slave narratives. And so that's another aspect of this narrative that links it very intimately to the slave narrative as a genre, as the neo slave narrative that it technically is. Douglass worked in the salt furnaces in West Virginia early on, and this work was very arduous, as was the work that he did in the coal mines. These were the material conditions that he experienced in the immediate moment after slavery ended. And as is the case within slave narrative writing, you see the quest for literacy invoked very passionately by Washington. He talks about the struggle that he went through to learn the alphabet, and he learned the alphabet through the blueback um, reader, which was commonplace, as your footnote in the Norden says, commonplace for teaching reading in the 19th century. My grandmother, Emma Lou Jenkins Richardson, used the blueback reader, so that's how I first heard of it. But to think about this as a kind of text that was so key for the teaching of reading comes up here for Washington, and then talks about what it meant to get teachers to work with him one on one and reconcile that schedule with his work schedule. Their aspect of tricksterism is there, where he talked about setting the clock back in order to give himself adequate time to get to school before his cohort recited. And so all of these dimensions of his narrative speak very profoundly to his commitment to attaining literacy. And we see this struggle enunciated from the inception of the African American literary tradition, and it's writ large in Washington's Up From Slavery. So that's definitely another element that bears noting. And not only the individual quests for literacy, but think about how he invokes the collective Black commitment to attaining literacy, regardless of age, like after slavery, what literacy meant. I think that that's another crucial thematic layer to pay attention to in this neo slave narrative. The There are some dimensions that even add humor to this work to some extent. Like he talks about that once he goes to school, he sees that the children wear hats, boys wear hats, and so he doesn't have a hat, and his mother is unable to buy him a store bought hat, but he's very thankful for the homespun one that she makes for him. And this is really a fascinating dimension of the Washington neo slave narrative, the idea of the homespun hat. And I think that it takes us back to, it kind of resonates with that whole critique of living within one's means. So this is another backdoor way for him to get those issues in, to talk about self-determination in the Black community, get rid of that whole keeping up with the Joneses mentality. So this is an early critique of that, that he kind of brings up, and emphasizing his mother's industriousness in making a hat for him, as opposed to paying, trying to do something that she couldn't do, or pretending to have money that she didn't have. And so he talks about, how thankful he was for it, how proud he was of it. He had some people make fun of him as a result of wearing a homemade hat, but then notes how, some of those same people are ones who didn't necessarily go as far or do as well as he did. And so this is interesting too, to think about what was going on. Mentioning the penitentiary in this way, I think is very provocative too, because the reality is that during that time, there were people who ended up in the penitentiary because they had been forced into convict leasing. The prison industrial complex was an emergent institution in the nation by the late 19th century and carrying out egregious atrocities against the black population. And so, you know, it wasn't as clear cut to always think about, people who were in the penitentiary because they ended up in there for, in some cases, yes, crimes that they committed, but in other cases because they were, unfairly institutionalized. So that statement, I think, is very weighted. Another thing, as we look at this homespun hat, that I am encouraged to do, I want us to think about is that, when we were talking about Equiano, there were all these different symbols that I mentioned, and you got a handout that discussed these various symbols like the 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 copper pot, the snow, the 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 all of the book, just different uh, objects that mediated Equiano's transition um, to slavery and from slavery to freedom. And I think that's true here. We can do a similar analysis of Washington and recognize the various symbols that emerge within the narrative economy of up from slavery. And so, yes, think about the significance of the symbolic significance of the homespun hat. Think about the symbolic significance of the ginger cakes. Think about the significance of the blue back speller, the reader, and then the flat shirt. He talks about how unsettling it was, how uncomfortable it was to wear this black shirt. And so all of these items I suggest have symbolic significance in marking the way, marking the timeline for Booker T. Washington from slavery to freedom. The work in the coal mines and the salt furnace, I think, is also important to contrast. I mean, for those of you who look at Victorian literature and study it, that child labor abuses could be egregious within that system and were very pervasive. And the basic protections that are associated with childhood were lacking. You see that in Charles Dickens's fictions like Oliver Twist and David Copperfield. And so there's a bit of that here. Just like you see some of the American Gothic, when Washington describes the plantation and the decay associated with it or how decrepit it was, precisely because neither whites nor blacks in some cases had the industriousness or the skills to do the basic repairs, to improve and enhance the quality of life in the plantation context. This is a point that Washington makes very clear. You see it to a certain extent in that decayed plantation that Charles Chesnutt describes in the Guford Grapevine. So the 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 child labor, the aspect of the story that he tells where his labor as a child is so exploited, I think is something to bear to pay some attention to. It's not that he's necessarily complaining about that, but I still think that we need to notice that aspect of the story. Similarly, he talks about the envy that he had for white boys, particularly because of their family lineage that kind of increased the expectations for them in some cases, and then talks about how there were no obstacles for them in terms of achieving success. So these are aspects of his autobiography that I think also reflect very significantly his individual outlook, and that's something to to note. But then he comes back and says that the Negro must work harder and be better. The idea again, that whole idea of being twice as good. So you see that conversation unfold on page 564. And if you could go to that, I think it would be useful. Miss Ruffner is another key person that he meets along the way, who teaches him how to be thorough in his cleaning because of her high and exacting standards. And she's perceived to be a very difficult person, but he actually develops quite a deep appreciation for her because of her her tenacity and the high and strict standards that she sets. So that's really significant. And in terms of making his journey to Hampton, it's noteworthy. And again, going back to those issues of literacy and advancing literacy and education in Black communities, that he talks about the collective support that he received from the people in his community, and especially the Blacks in his community, alongside his family. And so keep that in mind. And there's this long journey that begins to unfold en route to Hampton Institute. And this is also a place where you see an emerging ethics of Jim Crow beginning to crystallize. This is his first awareness that he has limitations because of his skin color. And so that dimension of his story is quite crucial, quite valuable to acknowledge. And so this is really the early 1870s, but even, and so remember from the historical information that I gave you last time on Paul Laurence Dunbar, we see that Jim Crow was officially institutionalized and became the law of the land in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision sanctioned by the Supreme Court in 1896. But you see an emerging world of Jim Crow even as early as Booker T. Washington's experiences on the road to Hampton. And so that's something significant. And within the discourses on slavery, usually the promised land refers to the North, but it's significant that here the promised land concept, as borrowed from the Jewish tradition, within the Black experience, is translated by Washington into a reference to Hampton, to this educational oasis that he perceives it to be. And so that motif of the promised land and its intimate connection to the story of African American education is also the linchpin through which Washington connects literacy and freedom. And so those are dynamics within this work that I really want us to pay attention to. The test that he's given, of sweeping a room speaks volumes here, by Miss Mary F. Mackey, someone who becomes a valued and treasured mentor for Booker T. Washington, and is significantly a Northerner who's gone, a white Northerner Yankee, as he puts it, who's gone south to support and advance the project of Black education, and more broadly, the initiatives for racial uplift that I've spoken about that emerged very saliently in the last decade of the 19th century among Blacks. But, figures like Miss Mackey paved the way. And so even though we can think of the Black investments in the notion of uplifting the race, there were many whites coming from the North to the South who were very committed to the project of Black racial uplift. And so that tune that I'm sending from Spike Lee's School Days, I'm building me a home, perhaps speaks better than anything to the collective commitment within the Black population for racial uplift and advancement. And the video, that overviews so many aspects of Black history is really powerful. Those visuals, I think, tell a compelling story on their own terms. But if you think about how Washington represents General Armstrong, Miss Mackey, these figures are quintessentially committed to the project of Black uplift through their commitment to teaching in the South and institution building in the South. So that's another important aspect. And this is also a part of his story linked to an emerging openness to white philanthropy, we might say, and that was just so crucial in shaping his story. And we'll continue to discuss some of those dimensions as we go on to W.E.B. Du Bois. The Atlanta Exposition Address it culminates the segment from Up From Slavery that's incorporated in the Norton. And it's when you think about what it means and how important it is that Washington copies, includes the full text of this address in his autobiography. And it was definitely a defining moment in his life, and is to this day linked very closely to his legacy. And so it's very revealing on a number of levels. So that I talked about the World's Columbian Exposition that happened in 1893 in Chicago, from which blacks were systematically excluded. And so it's ironic that in the South, an emerging New South, Washington is given such a salient platform on which to share his ideas. And so the speech starts off with a critique of Reconstruction, suggesting that there was this investment in starting out at the top, becoming elected officials or whatever, when the best thing may have been to start out at the bottom. There's that motif, that repetitive reference, that line, cast down your buckets where you are. And that is very significant, and phrasing for which this speech is well remembered. The 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 desire on the part of Washington is to encourage white Southerners to recognize the value of the black population and the unique contributions that they can make to the South as a region. So that's key. And then, he downplays the need for blacks to press for social equality or for their legal rights. And that's one of the things that made this speech unsettling for a lot of the black audience that heard it eventually. They were very unsettled that he seemed to compromise too much on the question of civil rights. And when we think about the timing of this speech in 1895, it's very significant because in 1896, again, there was the Plessy versus Ferguson decision that literally made segregation a law of the land. So, the law of the land, I mean. And so when Booker T. Washington asserts that we can be as separate as the fingers on the hand, yet like together as the hand, it's like they were just mystified and deeply unsettled, even just deeply disappointed that he would basically sanction segregation. But Washington may have had a strategy that he was using of, maybe deferring in order to advance the economic interests and business interests of the black population. But whatever his intentions, that was a sore spot, where he seemed to compromise on the issue, the question of voting rights. And so this speech was also a platform that definitely amplified his public voice and influence and really expanded the platforms to which he had access, culturally speaking. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And we can think again of the marginalization and exclusion of blacks at the World's Columbian Exposition versus the salience that they're given here, the Negro building that's on the property, on site at this major exposition in Atlanta, and the fact that Washington is invited to be a judge. And so even in an emerging segregation, you had Washington being validated and embraced very heartily by the white population. So that's, I think, another interesting dimension. Washington expresses a lot of confidence, actually, in the ability of the white population to accept and respect blacks over time if given space to do that, rather than having legislation forced on them. But the irony is that even as he expresses that confidence toward the end of this speech, what we see is that Jim Crow lasted for over a half century, with Plessy versus Ferguson. And so maybe one thing that he did was to overestimate the goodwill of the white Southern population at that time. He encourages blacks to deport themselves modestly here. And so that's another level on which this speech seems to sanction accommodationism. He supports voting rights, but again suggests that the quest for this privilege be be kept in perspective. Maybe that blacks should consult the the whites that they know or who supported them in business in order to really get a sense of how they should deploy their votes. So again, there was kind of like an excessive faith that he seems to invest in the white population that didn't necessarily sit well with some of his critics. Overall, this speech, though, seems to um, underscore the value of democracy. So, all of these layers of up from slavery, I want to emphasize and put on the table for discussion, and also think about on the road to our examination of W.E.B. Du Bois next week. And one of the things too that I want um, to go into maybe are some of the resources related to Booker T. Washington that are important to examine to get a more complex understanding of his legacy. Thank you all so much.